So tonight's main topic is about miniature agnostic games and why I think you may have it wrong, or you may be wrong about miniature agnostic games. This is not about kind of pointing the finger, saying if you like miniature agnostic games, you are wrong for playing them. If that's what you think this is about, you've kind of misunderstood my title. But I want to start by saying, what is a miniature agnostic game? Because there was a few people, when I shared this on Facebook, weren't quite sure what I meant. So if you think about a game like Warhammer 40k, like Age of Sigmar, there are rules for the game, and then there are miniatures that are available to purchase that go with that game. So if there is a stat that says Primaris Space Marine Captain, because there's not many of those, is there? If there's a stat for that, then the company, Games Workshop in this case, makes a miniature that then goes with that stat. If they have certain weapons, it may be that they have miniatures that have those certain weapons. So that is just a general kind of miniatures game. It's a kind of like a rules or a game system, if you like, from that company. There are then other games, things like Star Breach, or things like Zone Alpha, which are quite popular miniature agnostic games now, which are essentially just rules that have been written to play a game, with the idea being that you can use any miniatures you like, because that company writing those rules don't have a miniatures range. They don't produce any miniatures. You basically just buy the rules and then play with any minis you like. Maybe stuff you've already got, or you may see stuff online that you like the look of and you then go and buy them. So that's what miniature agnostic games. It's a game that basically does not have any specific miniatures designed to be used with it. And I get asked every single live stream, every single week, about why don't you play more miniature agnostic games? Why don't you play them? You've got loads of minis now. Why do you not play them? And I've given a few different reasons over time about why they're not really for me personally. And I'll go into some of them tonight. But I want to go over the pros and cons, if you like, of miniature agnostic games. And I also want to kind of tell you why I think people are generally wrong about them, when they keep trying to kind of like sort of push them, if you like. So why are miniature agnostic games a good thing? So what it does is it lets new games designers get a game to market without having to worry about sculpting a full range of miniatures, without having to worry about the kind of all of the retail stuff that comes with it, without having to worry about the costs involved in getting miniatures sculpted. There's a lot of games, if we take Frostgrave as a prime example, that game probably wouldn't have seen the light of day if you had to have a miniatures range in order to launch a game. There are some miniatures available for Frostgrave now, but that's more to do with kind of like licensing and partnerships that Joseph McCulloch has had with North Star Miniatures. And the same things happened for Stargrave as well. But those games are designed by a company that do not make miniatures. And it means they can kind of focus on getting the rules out there to people and not having to worry about trying to sculpt sort of 200 miniatures in order to launch a game. Now, these games also, a positive thing about them is they tend to be quite stable over time as well. So they don't have to have constant stat changes and updates. So they're good for players who just want a fun, stable experience. One of the reasons they don't have these stat changes is because they're not relying upon selling miniatures to basically drive sales. They're not kind of saying, right, what we need to do is we need to change all of the stats now because we want to launch a whole new edition of this game. We're going to change these stats because we want to launch this new miniature, and in order to launch this one, the stats don't quite fit with the current kind of scale and stuff. So we're going to change the stats. We're going to change the range a little bit in order to launch this new miniature. So it frees kind of me and you as the player base from constantly chasing kind of new releases and stats for it. So if you're kind of just looking for a fun experience, these can be quite stable. They very rarely get kind of like big sweeping updates. Also, you don't feel tied to any particular miniature range. So if you particularly like Space Marines, for example, but there's certain ones you don't like, or if you see kind of a company like Hassle-Free Miniatures who just make miniatures, if you see a range of stuff that they produce on their site and you'd really like to use them in your game, then these kind of games very much allow you to use whatever you like. If you want to change the scale of the game, you can use whatever you like. So you can kind of let your imagination run wild and build those armies or those crews that you have pictured in your head. So there's no tie to kind of feeling that you have to have sort of this model to represent this particular stat, because there isn't a model for it. You're encouraged to buy whatever you like. Also, they can be very much cheaper to play as well, because you probably already have a lot of miniatures, so you can kind of get double use out of them. Maybe you've bought miniatures for a game that you played 2 or 3 years ago, and you don't want to sell them because you painted them really nice and you really like the look of them, but you're just not playing that game anymore. So you've got a whole host of miniatures that you can then use in some of these miniature agnostic games. And it also means that the rule sets tend to be a little bit cheaper as well, because the general overheads for these companies that are writing the rules, they're a lot lower. So for example, we talked about Games Workshop there. They have hundreds and hundreds of people working for that company. They have HR department, they have pensions, they have like marketing, they have all of this kind of sort of overheads that go into a bigger company. If you've got one guy who's essentially kind of sitting at home writing rules, his overheads are a lot lower. Therefore, the profit margins on the books themselves are a lot lower as well. So it generally means the rules are a little bit cheaper. Andy Smith in the chat there is saying, is Gaslands one? Yeah, Gaslands is a miniature agnostic game. The company who make Gaslands, or the person that makes Gaslands, does not sell any miniatures for the game. People tend to use Hot Wheels cars, and people tend to use kind of like Matchbox cars and things like that. But you could use anything. You could use bits of cut up paper. You could use plastic tokens. You can use whatever you like. You can use aeroplanes if you wanted to kind of take toy aeroplanes if you wanted to have a kind of aeroplane sort of game. So there's no miniatures, if you like, attached to it. A lot of the games that come from Osprey rules, things like Dragon Rampant, things like Last Days, like from Ash Barker as well, the kind of zombie apocalypse game. These are all games that don't have miniatures attached to them, and they're good examples about why these are kind of generally a good thing. So on the flip side of it, why are miniature agnostic games not such a good thing? I wouldn't necessarily say bad, but why are they not as positive? So it's actually quite tough to build a business out of just writing rules. So it usually means it's a bit of a hobby for the creators. I mean, there are some exceptions to this. I think Joseph McCulloch, who's wrote Rangers of Shadowdeep and Frostgrave and Stargrave, has generally done okay out of this. I don't know whether this is his full-time job. I assume it is. But generally what happens is a lot of these rule sets are done by people who... It's a bit of a hobby. They've always wanted to write a rule set, and they might actually get to the point where they can release it maybe just as a PDF online that people sort of pay a few pounds for and download the PDF. Maybe they might kickstart it and get people to actually buy a hardback printed book or something. But it's generally not a long-term business plan. It might be something that makes a little bit of money in the short term, but that can generally kind of drift away just as quickly as well, because there's a whole host of these games. So, like I said before, the exceptions are few and far between, but if there's nothing long-term to buy for the game, it's quite hard to support the creator. The creator might be sort of working on expansions and things like that, but it's quite difficult for the people writing these rules to kind of kick on and create a business out of this. If they have miniatures to sell, that's a constant stream of income coming in, which allows them to then kind of sort of invest back into a business. Unfortunately, it then also takes them away from writing rules. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. By design, miniature agnostic games tend to be not really set in a specific kind of universe or a world, if you like. They're intentionally loose so that you can create the world that you want to play in. For example, I've seen sort of Rangers of Shadowdeep rules used to play with Star Wars miniatures. I've seen it used to play with kind of like fantasy miniatures. I've seen it used for a number of different settings. Now, there is still some background created for the game, but it's maybe not as rich and as immersive as something like Age of Sigmar or Kings of War or Wild West Exodus or something like that. Something where the company making these games and selling these models has created a whole universe of really rich kind of background, if you like, to get immersed in. These miniature agnostic games generally are just rules. There might be a little bit of flavor text, there might be a little bit of kind of world building just to kind of get you started, but generally they are there just to kind of to be very loose, to allow you to create your own world. Now you might say, well, that's a great idea. That's exactly what I want to do. For people like me, that is a negative. I actually like to get... the first thing that attracts me to a game is generally, what do the miniatures look like? And secondly, what's the world? What's the story around a game? And if those two things are attractive enough, I'll generally then look into the rules of a game. Maybe I'm more of a visual gamer. Maybe I'm less about the rules. But it's one of the reasons why miniature agnostic games don't really kind of scream out to me. I get that you can create your world yourself, but for me, I get dragged into a game by the world. Wild West Exodus is a prime example. Malifaux is a prime example. Infinity is a prime example. I love the universe around those games. Now, no miniatures range can also mean that these games often become overlooked. Because the creators not making vast sums of money from these kind of things, there's generally no money to market these games. And because they don't have miniatures to make them like, sort of to showcase them, to show them off, they're largely kind of like unidentifiable. So if it comes to kind of promoting a game on YouTube, if you see a kind of like a thumbnail or something for a game on YouTube and it's using Age of Sigmar models, you might just look at it and go, it's Age of Sigmar, that's not really a game I'm interested in. It's quite hard to market a game that doesn't have a visual identity. So when it's just rule sets with no real world around it, it's quite hard to get it out there in front of it. And what this tends to mean is some games just generally get overlooked. And actually, it can be really hard to find players to play these games against as well. Now, because it means that they're super niche, and these really are super niche within a small niche anywhere, it is hard to find opponents to kind of play these games against. Unless you're playing with a buddy who's really interested, and the two of you have talked about it, if you like, and it's, shall we try this rule set? A lot of these games generally don't really see the table. People might buy the rules and have a look through them. They might even kind of like build some warbands for them, but they generally don't play a lot of games of them. And one of the big things for me personally, and I know this is a big thing for others as well, because they've told me, is that with no identifiable or instantly identifiable miniatures, that as a player or as an opponent, you don't instantly know what you're playing against. So if you're playing, I don't know, let's say if you're playing Kings of War and somebody has a dwarf regiment that's basically iron breakers, because you know what Mantic's dwarf iron breakers look like, you instantly know that's what they are. If you're playing a game of 40k and somebody has sort of Death Guard Plague Marines, you instantly know what Death Guard Plague Marines look like because you have a memory of seeing them elsewhere. If you're playing a miniature agnostic game, there's a period of time of adjustment where you're constantly having to try and remember, oh yeah, what did he say that one was again? It's got a gun, it looks like it's a sniper, I think it possibly might be this one. It's just an extra layer of a barrier, really. It's not a problem so much. It's just an extra barrier into the ease of getting into a game very quickly. So, those are kind of pros and cons. Those are some of the things that I thought about. So why do I think that people have it wrong? So, whilst miniature agnostic games, such as the ones we've talked about, things like Zone Alpha, things like Last Days, I think it is, and things like Star Breach, they are becoming more popular. Sort of YouTube channels like Guerrilla Miniature Games, he certainly kind of advocates a lot of that. Because he writes them himself, he has a bit of a kind of like a network of friends who also write those games, and he's very, very prominent in pushing those out to a community. You've got people like Uncle Atom from Tabletop Minions, who again is very keen on games like Zone Alpha. So they are becoming more popular, and with the rise of 3D printing, of sort of resin printers becoming quite cheap now, and people sort of starting to, there's lots and lots of Patreons where you can download miniatures each week and print them out. It might seem like an obvious choice to pick up these rules-only games, but I think what people overlook, and something that people who talk about miniature agnostic games quite passionately, I think what they overlook is any game is miniature agnostic. If you want it to be, you can play 40k with any miniatures you want. You can play Kings of War with any miniatures you want. You're not forced into buying a range. You might choose to buy into a range, but you're not forced into it. So just because you have a lot of miniatures that you want to use doesn't mean you have to go down the route of buying the rules for a miniature agnostic game. So unless you're at a GW store or you're at a GW official event or something like that, you can just use whatever you like. I understand that Games Workshop don't want you using other companies' miniatures in their store. That's not what they sell. It's like you kind of buying 4 cans of lager from the supermarket and then going down the pub down the road and sitting drinking them in the corner. I can understand why they don't want you to do that. But if you're just playing, if you're playing in the garage with a friend, just use what you like and play whatever rules you like. If you're playing down the local club with a friend, just use whatever you like. It doesn't really matter if you've got like a club that meets at the local church hall. You can, as long as you agree with each other, you can use whatever you like. This has never been something that's like new. Miniature agnostic rules might be growing in kind of like popularity, and it might be becoming sort of more accessible to get them out there onto the internet and get them in front of people. But it's not a new thing. Like, you've been able to play games with you've been able to play games rules with any miniatures you like since there was the first ever rule system. We kind of see it a lot in historical games, and we don't really question it. They're not miniature agnostic. Like even Bolt Action, for example, like sort of Warlord have a range. But you can buy whatever you want, and nobody really seems to kind of like sort of flick their nose about it. But when it comes to kind of 40k or Age of Sigmar or something else, people seem really kind of uptight about it. And the companies themselves, they're not enforcing this. They can't physically come around your house and say, look, if you want to play a 40k, you've got to use our miniatures. Like, if you're just playing for your own enjoyment, it doesn't really matter what miniatures you use. So, like, you can literally play whatever you like. The other side of it is, there are so many games out there now that have free rules and free stats. Look at Malifaux, look at Wild West Exodus, look at Kings of War. There's lots of, I mean, just as a few examples, there are lots and lots of games out there that allow you to download the rules for free. They allow you to download the stats for free, and then you can use any miniatures you want to try that game out. So these games are even cheaper than going down the route of miniature agnostic games. So if you're really intent on using the miniatures you've got to save some money because you've already got loads of stuff, why go down the route of buying miniature agnostic rules? Why not use any of the free rules that are already available? Now, yes, these companies release these rules because they want you to try them out. They want you to kind of get a flavour for it, and then maybe you'll get pulled in and start buying their miniatures range. But you don't have to. It's an option. It's a choice. So yeah, I mean, if you're playing in a store, I'd advise that you play with store-bought minis. Like if you're kind of like a local gaming store, I kind of advise that you play with the miniatures that you bought there. I'm not advocating going sort of printing out a full 3D printed army and going down the local store and basically just saying, yeah, I'm not spending any money with you, but I will use your tables. So you use the miniatures that you bought, if you like. But I'm sure most stores don't really care what miniatures you use. Like a lot of this comes from being enforced by the community, not by the companies. Like, the community themselves are what enforces this kind of stuff. Like, 40k community are probably very kind of sort of passionate about not using other companies' miniatures when you're playing their games. And I think there's an element of, I've spent a fortune on stuff. Why should you get to play on the cheap kind of thing? And I think there's a bit of gatekeeping in that. And I'm sure other kind of companies or other communities probably feel the same as well. But there really is nothing stopping you using any miniatures in any game. So this term of miniature agnostic gaming is almost a bit of a moot point. It's almost like, yes, there's some rules out there which don't have minis with them, and there's some rules out there that do have minis with them. But you can play any game you like with any minis you like. Like, don't feel that there's a kind of like there's a left side and a right side, or pit these things against each other. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. That's why I think people might kind of have it wrong. Is that I think there are still people out there who think, I've got all these minis I want to use. I know I'll go and buy a rule set for a miniature agnostic game so I can use them. And that's where I think like people have it wrong. You can use them in any rule set you want. Now, I'd love to know what you think. Put your kind of comments either in the chat tonight or down in the comments below this video if you're watching this back from one of the clips videos. I'd love to know what your point of view is. As I said, they're not really for me. They're not something that I enjoy. I like to kind of get into a game around the world building, but I'm not bashing them. They're like, you know, if you like the rules, you like the rules, but don't ignore a good rule set just because it's got miniatures that you think you have to buy.
Thanks for watching my video. I hope that you really enjoyed it. And if you did, why not consider clicking on the suggested video below to see more of the work that I've done. If you'd like to support the long-term sustainability of this channel, why not consider checking out my Patreon, where you can pledge and support from as little as $2 a month. And there is lots of different tiers and bonuses, which will give you access to a private Discord server. It will give you free t-shirts, free mugs, a podcast every month, and a number of other things, including getting your name at the end of every video, like these awesome folks who already support me now.